Welcome to the Zen Studies Podcast. Thanks to new supporting members of the podcast, Audrey from Lisboa in Portugal, Camille from Northolt in the UK, Shane from Dunedin in New Zealand, Lauren from Huntsville, Alabama, and James from Eugene, Oregon. Thanks for your encouraging support. I apologize for releasing only 2 episodes in February instead of my usual 3 episodes a month. I am busy preparing for our Sangha's first session, that is a multi-day, full-time silent meditation retreat, our first in several years since before COVID. And this will take place March 20th through the 24th. And it'll be possible to participate in this retreat via our Cloud Zendo from home. And if you're curious about that, visit brightwayzen.org. In this episode, my second in a short series on spiritual questions, or perhaps you might say spiritual questioning, I talk about various reasons why people may resist asking spiritual questions or maybe find it difficult to come up with them. And then I'll talk about the relationship between karma work and awakening, because in my next episode or two, I'll explore in depth how to come up with what I'm calling karmic questions, and then how to come up with awakening questions. So, first of all, questions themselves. For some people, it can be tricky, especially once they've practiced a while, to come up with questions. After a while, you may or may not, but many people don't have too many practical practice questions left. You know, how to sit zazen, how your Sangha operates, basic teachings and terminology. Or even if you know there's a lot more about the practice and teachings you don't know, you recognize you're in this for the long haul and you just settle in, figuring you'll pick things up gradually by osmosis. So why keep, looking for or asking questions when you know the answers aren't going to magically make walking the path of practice any faster or easier? So beyond moral behavior, there are no shoulds when it comes to Buddhist practice. But we are more likely to grow spiritually if we start exploring karmic, awakening, and skillful means questions once we run out of practical practice questions. And I talk about these different kinds of questions. I talked about them in the last episode. Again, it's not so much that we need to come up with neat questions, which can be expressed in complete sentences, but rather that we stay connected with our Bodhi mind and sense of curiosity. As I mentioned in episode 230 on Bodhi mind, the path of spiritual growth and discovery is endless. Buddhahood is about our human capacity. Fulfilling our potential isn't about right or wrong or should. It's just a natural and beautiful process. Another reason some people find it difficult to come up with spiritual questions is frankly because they are fiercely independent. And it doesn't appeal to ask someone else a question, especially one that you really care about. Now, some of us were teachers' pets throughout our schooling, including our spiritual schooling, and eagerly raising our hands to ask questions and offer answers in order to get confirmation of whether we're right or not. Fiercely independent folks, in contrast, may be introverted or private. As long as they are in doubt about something, they want to keep it close to their chest, only revealing a question long after they have resolved it. And in one sense, there's nothing wrong with the habit of keeping your questions to yourself, as long as you're still asking and investigating questions. Even if you are inclined to share your questions publicly, the greatest value of the questioning process is internal. Most of the time, it doesn't really matter what a teacher or anyone else says in response to your question anyway. You almost always have to figure out your own answer or find your own way to the answer. However, there is something extremely valuable about learning to clarify your questions and express them to others. Now, you might actually get some valuable feedback, but even more importantly, trying to express your questions can be an essential part of the overall process of inquiry and learning. It's a common occurrence for people to make an attempt to express a karmic, awakening, or even skillful means question, but then feel quite dissatisfied with how it comes out verbally, or with the lack of complete understanding on the part of others. Now, sometimes this sense of inadequacy in communication is about your limited skill with words or limited experience talking about spiritual questions, but often it is about the fact that you have not yet fully clarified what your question is. A sense of frustration as you try to express your deepest spiritual concerns can be very useful feedback about where you are in your process. It's not a negative thing, it's just noting, if I can't quite express this yet, maybe I'm still in the process of clarification and discernment. Expressing spiritual questions out loud is also an opportunity to challenge your trust issues and pride. You may fear negative judgments from others if you share your questions and doubts. In many cultures, talking about our unresolved questions and issues, especially if we're emotional about them, can cause others to pity us, make assumptions about us, conclude we're weak, or offer unsolicited advice. We may also really want to appear smart and capable and therefore feel uncomfortable in a setting where maybe a so-called teacher might correct us or presume to answer our question as if they know something we don't. Expressing our questions despite our misgivings can teach us to stay connected with our inner authority, what really matters to us, even when we're concerned about the opinions of others. For example, I was quite relentless, emotional, and public about my spiritual questioning throughout the first 10 years or so of my practice. I remember feeling angered and mortified quite often when people would take a one-up position with me and offer me advice or solace or pity. Sometimes, on occasion, a whole group of people would turn and make me and my question or issue the subject of the conversation, as if they were a team assigned to solve my problem for me, because obviously I wasn't able to resolve it for myself if I'm mentioning it to them. This infuriated me, because all I really wanted was the opportunity to speak about a question I was still in the middle of exploring and have a deep conversation with my Dharma friends about it. Despite these occasional negative experiences, however, I refused to stop asking questions or speaking about them in public settings. Finding the answers to my questions was infinitely more important to me than protecting my ego. Other people find it difficult to come up with spiritual questions because They just want to do the practice and not think about it too much. And this isn't the worst approach. It's much better than intellectualizing about practice and not actually doing it. However, if we don't actively seek to arouse and maintain a questioning mind, we can easily fall into complacency. As I said in the last episode, a questioning mind is curious, open, humble, and attentive. We stay aware of our own limits and what we do not yet know. We look critically at life instead of coasting along on assumptions or being satisfied with superficial answers. If you're at all worried about over-intellectualizing practice, it may help to know that spiritual questions, as I'm talking about them, are not simply intellectual. They may certainly involve the intellect to some extent. They may involve teachings or concepts or words. But spiritual questions, as opposed to merely intellectual ones, are also very personal. We care about the answers. The answers are relevant to our experience of life and to the choices we make. Ultimately, spiritual questions are about how we personally live a more enlightened life. Finally, some people may find it difficult to come up with spiritual questions because of the subjective nature of the questions. It may feel like questioning focused on ourselves is indulging in self-absorption. Me, me, me. How do I feel? How do I act? What can I change? However, there's a huge difference between taking responsibility for yourself, on the one hand, and mulling constantly over your own preferences or dramas or contemplating the injuries others have inflicted upon you. We focus on ourselves because we're the only ones in the entire world who can, and because we're taking responsibility, not just for our behavior, but also for the kind of experience we have of life in general. So we're not focusing on ourselves and dismissing other people because we're more important, just because we're the ones who are responsible for ourselves. So I discuss the value of cultivating greater self-awareness at length in episode 15. To study Buddhism is to study the self and why that's not selfish. Far from being self-indulgent, it's actually very advantageous to find yourself fascinating. This doesn't mean you assume you're more fascinating than anyone else inherently, just that human beings are fascinating. Especially when you can directly observe their every thought, emotion, and impulse, which of course is exactly what we can do with ourselves. This self-study is what Dogen is referring to in Fukan Zazengi when he tells us to, quote, learn to take the backward step that turns the light and shines it inward, end quote. So assuming you've overcome your resistance to spiritual questions, how do you go about coming up with meaningful questions? I'm not going to talk about how to come up with practical practice questions. These are straightforward questions about Buddhism and meditation, texts and teachings, Sangha, and how to apply the practice in your own life. I encourage you to be bold with your questions, because there's usually at least one other person in the room wondering the same thing. In this series, first, I'm going to discuss karmic questions, and then I'll talk about awakening questions, and finally, skillful means questions. Before I get into that, though, in the next episode or two, I want to say something here about the relationship between karma work and our efforts to awaken. Depending on who you are, it might be tempting to see karmic questions, that is, questions meant to result in greater self-understanding, as inferior to awakening questions, which you might describe as existential questions about the nature of your experience as a human being. As I discuss in episode 72, Taking Care of Our Lives, more about the karma relationship side of practice, karma work can get messy. It's about untangling our karmic knots, facing difficult things about ourselves, putting in the work to change our habits of body, speech, and mind. We might imagine that awakening questions, in contrast, are about sitting around contemplating profound spiritual matters like oneness and Buddha nature. Who wouldn't prefer the latter? Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, we can't skip karma work in order to concentrate solely on awakening. That's just not how it works. I discussed this at length in episode 38, the two sides of practice, samadhi power and karma relationship. So you could see samadhi power as those aspects of practice which are aimed at awakening to what I've been calling reality with a capital R, including the truth of emptiness and suchness and Buddha nature. Karma relationship or karma work is about understanding and taking responsibility for your particular karmic package. Your body, mind, heart, circumstances, conditioning, tendencies. If we neglect awakening work and just work on our karma, we can end up feeling like we're bogged down in an unending struggle to change, a never-ending self-improvement project, that we're faced with kind of a permanent situation of inadequacy. If we neglect karma work and just try to awaken to deep spiritual truths, we tend to go on causing suffering for self and others and fall into the trap of spiritual materialism, that is, using spiritual practice for more or less self-centered ends, or spiritual bypassing, using spiritual methods to just avoid our painful feelings and thoughts. On the positive side, karma work can lead to greater self-acceptance, stability, moral behavior, generosity, trust, and openness. Because of our karma work, as incremental and messy as it can seem sometimes, we can become better able to sit still, face things, calm our mind, and open to insight. So karma work supports awakening. Awakening work, which I've also called samadhi power, or in my 9 fields of practice, cultivating insight, it can lead to foundational insights which realign our whole being and make it easier to see through and resolve our karmic issues. Also, when we awaken to our true nature, we recognize how we are not fundamentally defiled by our karma. This can make karma work more of a joyous activity and less of a duty that may sometimes feel like a penance. So, awakening supports karma work. In the next episode, I'll talk at depth about coming up with karmic questions. I'll probably have to save a discussion of awakening and skillful means questions for subsequent episodes, but I hope you'll tune in. Thanks for listening.